I'm here today to talk to you about the Common Core, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And you're probably right in the trenches when it comes to the Common Core. And of course, this is being fought in many different states in the country right now. It's being fought in Ohio, maybe with some success. We'll see how things go on Wednesday. But it's also something that's going to be discussed and fought and implemented or rejected at the district level. Because even in a state like Texas, which has rejected the Common Core resurfaces and tries to go sell itself to the individual school districts. And even if it passes at the state, I would suggest to you that the more that the parents see of the Common Core, the more they're actually going to expect their board representatives to have something to say about it, particularly to shed some light on it. And right now, the only thing that you're getting out of the educational establishment is just obfuscation. And they have their talking points, and they're somewhat convincing until, of course, you start asking questions. But at this point, they control the language, and that's the problem. And I'm going to try, as best I can in the half hour that we have, to work you through what I think is the case, the academic case against the Common Core. And then we may have some time for questions. But at any rate, first of all, I'm going to try to walk you through the Common Core documents themselves, specifically the English standards, as you would encounter them if you were just reading them. How many of you have tried to read the English standards? Did you find them to be impenetrable jargon?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I am here as your translator. And then, in the second half, I'm going to try to give you some red meat of some things that you would actually see in Common Core textbooks, which I think you would find disturbing, and certainly most parents would. The Common Core, I think, is best understood, and I'm referring to the English standards, as being governed by insufficient, illiberal, and highly ideological aims of education. And that's the overarching purpose of it. It consists in a set of substandard academic standards, a pseudoscience of text complexity whose purpose is to justify the study of questionable readings in what was otherwise a traditional literature class, combined with an obvious bias and superficiality in the selection of those readings, simplistic and mind-numbing ways of reading any good literature that remains, and then finally, a tyranny of textbooks that ensures teachers will force on students the absurdities and the bias that constitute the strange brew of the Common Core. As such, the architects of the Common Core are what I call story killers, because what they're doing is they're trying to kill off the great stories of our tradition, anything that looks like traditional literature. Now, this is a lot to take in, but there's some phrases that I think we should have that we employ. And one of those phrases about the Common Core would be big promises, no delivery. There's a lot of talk about what it's going to do. There's no way that it can deliver these things, and there's no proof that it has. The other phrase that I find helpful is superficiality and bias. Because the more you look into the standards, the more superficial you find them to be, at times just simply absurd, and also the more utterly biased you find them to be, both politically and morally. Let's start with the purposes of education. The purposes of education advocated by the Common Core are insufficient, illiberal, and covertly ideological. All we hear from the Common Core is what? What's their phrase? What are they trying to produce?
Rigor.
College and career readiness. College and career readiness. It's on the front flap of every English textbook when you turn open the book. And then this college and career readiness is connected to the 21st century global economy, which has us all scared to death. Well, there are two things that are wrong with this kind of rhetoric. The first thing is that the architects of the Common Core quote, no college president, no college professor, no study that indicates that colleges are just crying out for the Common Core in order to make students college ready. There's no one who wants this at the college level. So they're just asserting what colleges must want. The second thing is problem, and I would submit to you that not very many businesses are either, because everything that I hear from business owners, both large and small business owners, are that our students can't read and they can't understand human things, and very often they lack a work ethic. The biggest complaint is usually not that they don't have the appropriate skills, because companies teach their workers' skills. They can't retrain them their entire minds. At any rate, the second problem with this whole rhetoric of college and career readiness is those are not the ends of education. The true ends of education are knowledge, truth, responsible citizenship, love of the good and the beautiful, family, faith, freedom. These are the ends of education. These are the goods. These are the highest goods that we start out with. Education is the business of making human beings, not of producing people who go into some sort of job training program and then later have that job and that's all they ever know or do. It's fine. Everyone wants a job. But the thing that they don't understand is, well, I think they may understand. The first thing that they're getting wrong is that jobs do not make the human mind. The human mind makes jobs. So by setting education low and saying that it's essentially turning it into job training, what you're doing is you're actually undermining your future prosperity, both individually and as a nation. The second thing that they probably do understand is that that students are not computers. They can be taught, but they can't be programmed. And if you just read through the rhetoric of the aims that they're trying to achieve, you can see that this is much more like programming students. It's not teaching them. And they use highfalutin phrases such as 21st century literacy. And there's even a phrase that says, we will help your, I don't know how they set it up, but they say your students will now become literate people in a 21st century. Really? So when Y2K came, did everyone in this room become illiterate all of a sudden? What is a 21st century literacy? I think the real fear that we need to have is all the children who are growing up nowadays who are not given proper reading instruction, and who on top of that are spending almost all their time behind computers, and who are slowly, no, actually very rapidly, turning words into letters and codes, like OMG and TMI. And the other day, I talked to some teachers, early elementary teachers, who overheard a kindergartner saying to another, WTF. She had no idea what she was saying, but she was using it because she heard her mom use it. WTF indeed. This is not literacy. So if we could recapture some of that 20th century literacy, that would be great for students. But if we're taken in by this rhetoric that the world has completely changed because of our machines, and now we need to let our machines do all the thinking for us, we're being duped. And we're being sold out. So at any rate, that's a big part of it. The other part is they're actually trying to justify taking away traditional stories and great stories. And they're upfront about it. On page 5 of the standards, which is only just the second page into the standards, they give you a graph where they say by the 4th grade they want students reading 50% literary text and 50% informational text. By the time the students graduate, and this is in English, mind you, they'll say that it's across the curriculum, but that's not true, especially if you start talking to English teachers and ask them what they're doing. At the high school level, by the time students graduate, they want students reading 70% informational texts to only 30% literature. Now that means two things. That means, number one, they're going to abandon longer, greater works of literature. So Dostoevsky wasn't being read, but if he were, he would be out. But even somebody like Mark Twain, they'll still tell you that they're teaching Mark Twain, but Huckleberry Finn has got to go because it's too long. They'll give you a snippet, maybe not even the whole thing, but at most you'll get a short story of Mark Twain. What are they doing with the informational texts? Where they're elevating the informational text to the level of Shakespeare, essentially, by privileging them. What kind of literary, or what kind of informational texts? Well, how about an article written by Atul Gawande for the New Yorker in June of 2009. This is recommended by the Common Core, called The Cost Conundrum, Healthcare Costs in McAllen, Texas. 2009, healthcare costs in McAllen, Texas. I wonder what was going on in the nation that would prompt someone to write about healthcare costs in the summer of 2009. Do you remember? Well, that debate now goes into the textbooks to train your students appropriately on what they're supposed to think about rising healthcare costs. By the way, how many of you have heard of Shakespeare? How many of you before this moment have ever heard of Atul Gawande?
No.
Well, he's read. Shakespeare, maybe.
Is he American?
Sorry?
Is he an American?
He's an American journalist, I imagine. So how does the Common Core pull this off? Why would we throw away great literature and replace it with forgettable articles from periodicals and worse? Well, it's a multi-step process into absurdity. And it begins with these things called the standards. Don't be fooled by the name. Standards is one of those words that has been artfully chosen because who in the world would ever argue against better standards in education? In reality, though, the standards are no more than a hodgepodge of low-level skills, of obvious things that never need to be written down in a world that practices common sense. Of the failed methods used in schools over the last 50 years, and a lot of new experiments with our children that will produce similar failure. The reason hardly anyone ever calls the bluff of the Common Core on its standards, and you hear a lot of states nowadays saying, well, we won't do the testing, but we'll keep the standards. They're a good set of standards. The reason you hear that is because no one will call the hand of the standards makers on what the standards actually mean. That's because they're written in this impenetrable education ease. So let's do an exercise in translation. On page 11 of the standards, the reader will get a taste of both the absurdity and the nothingness of state standards. Standard RL 2.9, meaning Reading Standards for Literature, 2nd grade, Standard 9, reads as follows. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Wow, fancy. Great standard, isn't it? Let's translate. By the end of the year, by the end of the 2nd grade year, read and comprehend literature. We hope that they comprehend what they read, including stories and poetry. What other kind of literature would they be reading in the 2nd grade level besides stories and poetry? But we're going to include that. In the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently. This refers to this pseudoscience of text complexity that I'll describe in a moment. But in other words, it just means at the 2nd grade level. With scaffolding. How many of you have heard the word scaffolding? It is the educational buzzword of the moment. It has been for a couple of years. Scaffolding simply means, it's taken from the metaphor of put up scaffolding when you're building a building, and once the building is built, you take the scaffolding away. In the old days, we used to call scaffolding teaching. Or you could even use the word help at the high end of the range. So, let me give you the standard again with our translation. By the end of the year, read and comprehend literature, including stories and poetry, in the grades 2 through 3 complexity band proficiently, with scaffolding as needed at the high end of the range. Or, students in 2nd grade should read and understand more difficult books at the end of the year than at the beginning. They may need help, though. Now that is a rigorous standard, folks. But the problem is, it's an empty problem. It's an empty promise. Because if you look at the actual books that are being recommended at the 2nd and 3rd grade range, they're mostly written within the last 20 years. They were all very popular when they came out. They're pretty cutesy. And they're not that challenging. One of the books that I found is called Tops and Bottoms, which on the Amazon page itself is a book for 4 through 8-year-olds. And they're recommending it for 2nd through 3rd graders as a challenging work of literature. Or there's another book that I've looked at, and I actually quote this one, called Cowgirl, Cake, and Cocoa, which is this monosyllabic account of this girl who has this, she's a cowgirl who has this horse called Cocoa, and she wants Cocoa to go herd some cows or something. And so she says, Cocoa, let's go herd some cows. And Cocoa says, but I'm thirsty. And so Cocoa takes a drink. And then Cocoa eats an apple, and so on, page after page. Most of the pages are actually color, or actually pictures. And this is what 3rd graders are going to be reading. Do yourself a favor, open up, even a children's edition, of Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. And if you want to see real text complexity. And the amount of intrigue that's built up in a few paragraphs about why his father's dead, whether he's, Aladdin's just a worthless kid. This magician comes out of nowhere and wants to help use Aladdin in order to take over the world, and introduces himself as his long-lost uncle. There's intrigue at the very beginning. That's text complexity. But in the standards, at the 2nd to 3rd grade level, none of the classics are read. No Aladdin and his magic lamp. No Hans Christian Andersen. No Little Mermaid. No Little Match Girl. No Ugly Duckling. No Emperor Wearing No Clothes. The Common Core is the Emperor Wearing No Clothes. But since we haven't read it, we can't show up and say that the Common Core has no clothes. So how does the Common Core justify the erosion of great literature and its replacement with simplistic stories and forgettable journal articles? That's where Appendix A comes in. Appendix A of the standards is a study in obfuscation. Here, the arch testers announce the earth-shattering revelation that students need to read complex texts. And as they get older, the more complex should the text become. Did anyone ever doubt that? Now, what they don't say is that students should read the classics. Because if they simply said this, they would be on to something. And they would have said a lot more about text complexity than all the stuff that they make up. What they say, though, is that text complexity is where it's at, and we have to find a way to measure text complexity. And in order to measure text complexity, we need a computer model that's mathematical. Now that strikes me as insane. Because when I look at an algebra problem, I don't say, that algebra problem doesn't have the same level of humor as a Mark Twain novel. We need to adjust that algebra problem. If you don't judge math by literary standards, why would you try to judge literature by math standards? Or a computer model especially. What they want to do is they want to take text, put them into this computer, and then the computer will tell us whether it's a complex text or not. Now, it actually gets worse than that, because the text that the computer model that they've chosen is called the Lexile framework. And it has this rating system. And the Lexile framework is wildly inaccurate. Because it says that The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck is a 2nd grade text. What? What? Here's my Grapes of Wrath. 581 pages. I'm going to go home and give it to my 3rd grader, who's pretty smart, and I want to see how far he gets through it. Meanwhile, see, what happens is literature that uses simple everyday language, but nonetheless builds a complex story, gets downgraded, whereas forgettable journal articles that use a lot of jargon, they then rate high on the Lexile index. So if you were to take, for example, the opening passages of Genesis, which any child can read, that would be rated very low on the Lexile framework. Even though the opening passages of Genesis are so packed that the greatest scholars in the world struggle just even to figure out what the different words mean in their context. So this is what's going on. The Lexile framework is there for a very specific reason, is because it downgrades literature in order to upsell a lot of this nonsense that they want taught. There are 2 other things about Appendix A that you should know. They have 3 criteria for choosing texts. The other one the other 2 are quality and range. So it's complexity, quality, and range. Quality they say nothing about. They don't have a separate appendix on quality. They don't tell you what it is, and there's a reason for that. If you start talking about quality in literature, people are going to get some ideas and say, hey, why isn't there more Twain in the curriculum? So they want to hide that discussion. But the term that they like is range. They want a range of authors. And they run a range of experiences. What does range mean? Well, range means they don't want the classics. They want a lot of, frankly, multicultural authors at the expense of the Western canon. And they also want a lot of modern authors. A lot of modern authors. And there's a reason for that. I'll tell you that in a minute. But if you look at Pearson's textbooks, for example, if you look in the first semester Pearson textbook for the junior year called The American Experience, all of American literature from the beginning, to include a lot of non-American authors, all the way up to 1914 in the first volume. The second volume, which is also supposed to be read this semester, from 1914 on. So 300 years of literature to include all the greats, like Melville, like Poe, like all of the founders, the Puritans, all those are stuffed into one semester's of the textbook. And then on the other semester, you have all this modern literature that most of us have never even heard of, frankly. And what's even sneakier is they actually take a lot of modern authors and put them into that first volume. For example, on the Founding Fathers, the founding era, which is called, there's a chapter called The Nation is Born, there's something like 113 pages, only 20 of which have actual words of the founders on them. About 20%. So it's a trick. So, what else? Appendix B. Appendix B is where you have this selection of text, exemplar text that they're recommending. How many of y'all have looked at Appendix B? Okay, a couple of you. Appendix B is window dressing. What they want to happen is they want you to see it and say, look at all these great authors. There's Shakespeare. Heck, there's George Washington. And there's even a speech of Ronald Reagan. How can you say that we're biased? How can you say that we're not reading great literature? If you actually look into what is going on, there are two things going on with Appendix B. Number one is these texts are all going to be read in snippets. They're not going to be read completely. And in fact, they may not be read at all. So for example, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice is in Appendix B. It looks like everybody in the nation all of a sudden is going to be reading Jane Austen. When you go to the Pearson textbook, you find that not only is Jane Austen not read, but Pride and Prejudice is only recommended for outside reading. On a certain page, it recommends a bunch of other books as well. So it's a complete farce to think that the students are actually going to be reading these things. Moreover, they're not going to be reading complete works of literature. They're going to get them in the same form that you would get them in standardized testing. So a snippet here, a snippet there. Nothing is going to be read more than 3 or 4 pages at a time because they're trying to reproduce testing conditions. On top of that, there is real bias in Appendix B. So for example, if you're looking through Appendix B and trying to find any religiously inspired authors, you will find 0. There's no John Milton recommended in the Common Core. Paradise Lost is the greatest epic written in the English language. And it doesn't even get a whisper in the Common Core. In terms of the American authors, there are no Puritan poets recommended. John Winthrop's A City Upon a Hill, which is the inaugural text in American literature, is not there. Even Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, how many of y'all read that when you were in high school? That used to be in almost every literature textbook in the country. That is not recommended in the standards. So what it looks like is religious literature is not very important to the people who are running the Common Core. Well, if it's not important to them, then it won't be on the testing, and if it's not on the testing, it doesn't get taught, period. So if you look at America, or America's or the Western literary tradition, it's usually stated like this. We descend from 2 parents. Athens on the one hand, Jerusalem on the other. Almost all of our literature is inspired by one of those 2. Well, we've just lost one of our parents, and the other one is being crippled. All in preference of new and modern literature. I could go on about Appendix B, but I just think that document has to be read closely to make sense of it. Let's dive into the textbooks a little bit to get a sense of the things that I've been talking about and how they're actually implemented in the classroom. This is from a book called The British Tradition. And it's supposedly there are 17 pages dedicated to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In those 17 pages, only 3 pages have Mary Shelley's words on them. And those words are not actually taken from Frankenstein. They're just an introduction that Shelley wrote to Frankenstein. So what are you using the other pages for? Well, there's a modern author called Elizabeth McCracken who introduces this to the unit by talking about ghost stories that she heard as a kid and nightmares that she had. In the margins of the teacher's edition, the teachers say to ask students questions about monster stories and urban myths that they might have heard as a young person. Students are invited to dress up like Frankenstein. There's a picture of Frankenstein taken from a 1950s movie, sorry. And then in addition to that, there are 5.5 pages, that's 2 more than Mary Shelley gets. Coming to you live from New York, it's Saturday night. A skit, which is a spoof from Saturday Night Live, is printed in the book. And the students, but only the advanced and talented students, are asked to act out the skit. I'll read a portion of the skit from you. This is where the monster is being confronted by some villagers. Villager 1, head villager. Well, maybe you're the monster. Head villager shakes his head. I'm not the monster. Points to Frankenstein's monster. Look at him. He's got a square head and green skin. Frankenstein's monster. Oh, great. Now it's a racial thing. You know what? You guys are a bunch of fascists. Villager with a torch again steps too close. Monster says, seriously, dude, get that fire away from me. In the margin of the teacher's edition, these instructions are given. Point out the use of the term fascist. Explain its traditional political meaning and how it has been extended to refer to any right-wing extremist group. Are y'all in a right-wing extremist group? I just want to know. I'd like to know to whom I'm giving talks. How about their sense of history? Well, there's an editorial that you will find, an editorial from the 1999 New York Times that appeared November 9th. And it's talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there's a short unit, this isn't another textbook, talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so this is going to be students understanding the fall of the wall, because of course, realize when today's students were born. So what does it say? Well, the article begins this way. The Berlin Wall was bound to fall eventually. Do you remember that New York Times in 1980, that article that said the wall will fall eventually? Do you remember that one? At any rate, the wall was bound to fall eventually. The editorial continues, but that it came down as bloodlessly as it did 10 years ago this week is largely a tribute to one leader. It continues. Today, Mikhail Gorbachev is a political pariah in Russia and increasingly forgotten in the West, but history will remember him generously for his crucial role in ending the Cold War and pulling back the Iron Curtain that Stalin drew across Europe in 1945. What? That's not the way you remember it? The name Ronald Reagan does not appear in the editorial. The name Ronald Reagan does not appear anywhere in this section on the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it gets better, because remember in Appendix B there was that speech of Ronald Reagan. The speech of Ronald Reagan was the one given at Moscow State University. The introduction in the textbook to the speech given at Moscow State University says this. Led by Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviets were blazing through the greatest changes they had seen since the 1917 revolution. Although reforms were rapidly taking root, they were not far enough from communist ideology for Reagan. In this excerpt, notice how Reagan restrains his strongly anti-communist sentiments while still extolling the ideals he represents. Is that the Reagan you remember? What about the Reagan of Mr. Gorbachev? Tear down this wall. That, you see, is not the speech that appears in the Common Core. So the speech at Moscow State University, one of the most innocuous ones that, I mean, it's good, it was good Reagan. One of the least important, historically, that he ever made is what they put in to keep out everything else that should be put in. That's what's going on. Well, do you want to hear about Tom Paine? There's a little snippet in the introduction of one of these textbooks. Tom Paine, essayist, hero of the revolution, father of the internet. Next to a silly cartoon. That's right. There's a silly cartoon of Paine sitting next to a computer, a laptop. And then we have somebody quoted from Wired News who says that Paine's ideas about communications are now relevant again because of the internet. Apparently for the 200 intervening years, they hadn't been very important at all. And then you have this question, asked in the margin of the teacher's edition. Ask what issue Tom Paine might sound off today if he were writing a blog on the internet. Answer? Payne would probably be concerned with economic issues, such as distribution of income. Let's see here. Let me check on my time. This gets better. I have scores of examples. How much time do I actually have in reality?
As long as
Do I have to be wrapped up in one?
Yeah, more.
5 minutes.
Aw. 20.
Okay. I will not give you the politically correct lesson on Thanksgiving, which I would like to get. Or I will not give you how they have messed up in the textbook, Sinners in the Hands of Angry God, by eliminating all biblical quotation out of 23 possible quotations. I won't tell you about the autobiography of Sandra Cisneros, which is held up to be the equivalent of Benjamin Franklin's. I will read one of the poems of Sandra Cisneros, which does not, however, make its way into the textbook. But nonetheless, this is the sort of poet that they're recommending in Common Core textbooks. I am the lust goddess without guilt, the delicious debauchery. You bring out the primordial exquisiteness in me. Or how about, because someone once said, don't do that, I like it when you do that. Does not, I don't want to mislead you, this does not appear in one of the Common Core textbooks, but there's an advocacy throughout the Common Core textbooks of this author. So if a young lady were to like this author and look her up on Amazon, this is what she would find instantly. But I will tell you about their lesson on marriage. This is a short story that appears in one of the Common Core textbooks by Kate Chopin called The Story of an Hour. This is introducing the volume in the teacher's edition. Mrs. Mallard gets the unexpected news that her husband has been killed in an accident. She quickly recovers from the shock to discover that what she feels is relief. Though she mourns his passing, she delights in the freedom that will now be hers. When Mr. Mallard returns as unexpectedly as he supposedly died, you see, he was not killed in the accident, Mrs. Mallard suffers a fatal heart attack. The doctors, mistakenly assuming that she had been grieving, attributes the death to joy that kills. Students Edition, background information on Kate Chopin. The Story of an Hour was considered daring in the 19th century. The editors of at least 2 magazines refused the story because they thought it was immoral. They wanted Chopin to soften her female character, to make her less independent and unhappy in her marriage. Undaunted, Chopin continued to deal with issues of women's growth and emancipation in her writing, advancing ideas that are widely accepted today. Which ideas are widely accepted today? That if your hubby kicks the bucket, you have freedom ahead of you? Did Mrs. Mallard have children? Might they have entered into the equation? But here's the lesson that is actually scripted that you're supposed to get out of this, that the children are being told. Which part of the paragraph illustrates Mrs. Mallard's independence? Answer. See, the answer in the margin of the teacher's edition is what the teacher then programs into the students. This is not what the students may come up with on their own. Her independence becomes clear when she spreads her arms to welcome the future. It is hers alone. Ask students, what does Mrs. Mallard's action symbolize and how does it affect readers? Possible response. The action symbolizes Mrs. Mallard's desire for independence. Readers are forced to reflect on the negative aspects of 19th century marriages. 19th century marriages. Weren't they sort of like marriages? So this is the sort of stuff that will actually be going on in the classroom under the Common Core. It's superficial, it's biased, and its purpose is to kill off the great stories of a great people and to diminish the beautiful imagination of young people and to deprive them of the moral education that they actually need to thrive in the world. Now, I've tried to cram a lot into 30 minutes. Hopefully this has been helpful. The book that I've written, which I will refer you to, and I know that there are actually state legislators who are reading this at the moment, it's called Story Killers, and it's meant to provide the language to beat the case, the academic case that's made on behalf of the Common Core Because I think the academic case is the thing that has to be, we have to know their language and expose it, and we have to also have a language of what the value of the liberal arts are and why they should replace the nonsense that's currently going on in the American classroom. Thank you.